Welcome. I'm James Calicut, waterfowl and upland game bird extension specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, assistant professor of upland birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, professor, waterfowl and wetlands conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. All right, well, welcome y'all. We're going to have a quail conversation today, so Mark is going to be pumped about that.
About frickin' time.
Yep. Mm-hmm. But one good news is if you're watching on YouTube, you don't have to see Mark because his camera's not working, so you can. That's a bonus.
Yeah, I don't think that was a sabotage job at all.
No, I don't know that much about technology to pull that off. So
you can't see me, unfortunately.
That's my story.
We can see Hamrick though.
Can see Hamrick, and that's good. Hamrick's dapperness would have overshadowed you anyway, so it's fine that your webcam.
Mark my words, over the years of this podcast, it's going to be your face, the only one left. Everyone's going to have technical issues more and more. And I don't know what's going on, guys.
Oh, well, all joking aside, let's jump into the topic. We've assembled the quail team here. Of course, everyone should know Mark by this point, but we've got Rick Hamrick as our guest today. He is the small game program coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. But that also means that he's kind of the quail coordinator of the state as well, since they're lumped in with the small game. And it's been Rick's background, too, with his graduate research, and a lot where his passion lies is in bobwhite. So he's a quail biologist. And Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, so I know y'all, Rick, you've probably had lots of questions. I know Mark and I have a lot about, seems like especially social media and such, a lot of things flying around, posts about eyeworms, these parasites in quail, and like some worry about these. What kind of effects are they having on quail populations and whatnot? So I thought we'd kind of tackle this, talk a little bit about what do we know about these parasites, both eyeworms and sickle worms, and what do we not know, and is there anything to show that these are really having some population level effects, something that we really ought to be focused on. So we'll get started on that to start with, but I do feel like I want to put the qualifying statement in general when it comes to quail, and y'all can either agree or disagree with me on this, that habitat is kind of the overarching factor influencing quail populations, and that if you have lower quality habitat or less habitat, these other environmental stressors can have a greater impact on those on birds. So whether it's predation or parasite load or climatic events, what have you, those types of environmental stressors are going to take a bigger toll when your habitat house isn't in order. So, primarily the issue with quail populations is going to be of habitat, the amount of it, and the quality of it. So I just want to put that out there to start with. That's the root cause, and these other things are kind of, other things that can influence it. Do y'all think that's a fair enough statement to make?
Yes, I do. I'll start, Rick, and then 100%. There is a preponderance of evidence, just enormous amount of evidence that habitat is the ultimate factor of causing not only historic declines in quail, but even current declines in quail, where people are trying and managing really good quail habitat at a scale enough to where it can affect a population. With very few exceptions, those populations are doing better or well, depending on how you want to look at it. And of course, that's a subjective term sometimes. So yeah, that's the issue. But you're right. When your habitat, I like that, habitat house is not in order. We should make a bumper sticker where it says, "Is your habitat house in order?" Go ahead and put that on record so no one steals it. But if you've got good habitat at a proper scale, then yes, you can have a healthy, productive bobwhite population. When you don't have those things, right, everything else seems to matter more. Predators, even hunting for that matter. And like you said, environmental stressor, that's a good word for it. Drought, that can, you can't really manage drought, right? That's an environmental stressor that really affects a quail population. Not as much over here as it does, say, in the more semi-arid western part of their range for bobwhite especially, But even droughts here, it can affect our hatches, can affect our brood success from year to year. Like it's an issue. So even when you have good habitat, and then you have another environmental stressor like that, it can exacerbate the impacts of other things because quail are not in as good a condition, and they're just like a human. When you're in poor health, you are more susceptible to anything, much less a parasite or any kind of virus or anything like that. So yes, the habitat is the issue of the quail world, and with that's always the first step. And when that's not the first step, it's really easy to go down a bunch of rabbit holes.
Rick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, that's a real good summary. I mean, that's really what we're promoting is habitat management. You kind of putting the cart before the horse a lot of times when you start, looking at some of these other types of practices, and as you said, when the habitat house is not in order, that's really got to be the first step. We see so many places that really are missing some components that are essential habitat areas to really increase quail. And like Mark said, at that scale, those are difficult things to impress on people. Just the whole issue of scale, how that affects population growth and response, and also just getting people to kind of realize the changes. It was hard for me, until I kind of started being a resource professional, thinking about things, just the land that I came up on, really how different things were kind of 30, 40 years ago, and you keep backing that up, back to 100 years ago. There's just been all these little subtle changes, and sometimes it's hard to put our mind's eye on it there as far as kind of what has changed. But when you start thinking about all those different things, well, the bean field that used to be over there, and even the harder things to understand, just the older crop types versus modern crop types, how those production systems work. And so a lot of things go into that, that habitat part of it. But yeah, I mean, really that's the first step is really managing habitat. And to really get populations back on a large scale, we got to start stringing multiple landowners together and getting habitat back at a larger scale to really kind of start seeing some more effects of quail populations increasing.
And where we see that happening, it's working.
Yeah, we do certainly have some examples of that in different places where it's been successful. Yeah.
Yeah, and Rick, we've had that conversation quite a bit, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the last time we had a quail-focused episode when we had John Mark with us. Just really, and we've talked about it on, a lot of them related to waterfowl or anything. That change in land use and whatnot, how quickly that can shift things for bobwhites, and how that and it's sometimes tough for us to realize how substantial that change has happened, from when we were kids to now, what that looked like, or from think about when our grandparents or parents were quail hunting to now, quite a bit of a change in the landscape and practices associated with the shift in land use too. So even things like agriculture, the land use might not have shifted, but the practices associated with it certainly have. So yeah, there's just a lot of things impacting that habitat part of quails, and so that's definitely number one, the issue that we all ought to really be focused on, but because it seems to be what the root cause of most issues when we're saying, oh, population's in decline, it's going to be habitat more often than not. So switching back to this particular topic, like I said, just see it a lot. I've had, I don't know how many emails or text messages or social media messages surrounding eyeworms in quail, and so let's start off on talking about this. So I am no parasitologist by any means. I don't know that any of us are, but in terms of how things like this can influence a wildlife population, I think we can have a pretty good conversation about that. But let's talk a little bit about what we know about these in quail and other galliforms, and maybe what we don't know, and if we don't know something, how do we go about figuring it out? So Mark, it seems, I'll throw the first question to you, I guess. It seems like anything nowadays, when it pops up on social media and it really people start talking about something, it seems like this is something super new, like this is a new phenomenon or new issue. Are these particular parasites something new to the quail world?
Great
is this
question.
something we're just now identifying?
Yeah, great question. No, eyeworms, and I'm not going to give the scientific names, I can't pronounce it, but it's easy to find. But no, eyeworms are not new to the quail world, or even to the game. Parasites are not new to the game bird world. they've done tons of research in the UK on nematode parasites and red grouse and all kinds of things. And there's documented evidence that sometimes parasites can have a population level impact on a game bird population. That's been well documented across the pond. Never been documented in bobwhites in the U.S. or anywhere to my knowledge. But no, I think if you dig into the literature, there's actually evidence of they were documenting eyeworms and bobwhite in Texas in the 60s, and other game birds, sharptails, I think in the 30s, maybe mid 30s. Somebody can check me on that. But these things have been around. Every population, just about every wildlife population, has some parasite or is capable of harboring a parasite. So parasites are not a new thing in any wildlife species, much less in the bobwhite sphere. So parasites exist. These eyeworms have been around. We've known about them. There has been a renewed interest in the research of them, probably in the last 15 years. And research is good. We need to explore anything we don't fully understand more in the event that it may become a population level issue at some day. And then we've got a bunch of research to know about it. I got made fun of years ago doing ringneck duck research when ringneck populations were on an incredibly huge rise based on the numbers. And I remember somebody said, "Why are you studying ringnecks when there's so many other waterfowl populations in decline?" And I said, "Well, I want to know. We didn't know a whole lot about ringnecks at the time in terms of tagging them and following them, and we wanted to know just so you're prepared." So look, the research on eyeworms, the more the merrier, right? We want to see research, but a couple things you said. What we know is these things they were documented in quail in the 60s. I know in Texas. I don't know about any other states. Rick, we were talking earlier, if anyone has documented them in the Deep South. I don't know if I'd have to go back and look at Rosine's book maybe to see if they talked about them any. Rosine, I think, talked a little bit about some of that stuff when he was doing his work. But yeah, they've been around. And you're right, James, like the social media, once something catches on now, it can fly, so it's we want to make sure we're keeping the public up to date with what we know and what we don't know about it. What scientists don't do enough is admit what they don't know. And that's something that we got to do a better job about. And in the quail world, and not just quail, but in the quail world in particular, we love a silver bullet, right? We love, hey, what's the one thing I can do to turn this ship around, right? There were times we thought it was surrogators. There were times we thought it was predator management. Now, Rick, if we go back, we could probably add a few more things to that. There's always something we think is going to solve the problem, and it always turns out it's never one thing. It's usually, unless that one thing is habitat, and that's the hardest one to affect the landscape with. So we know they've been around. We know they're not novel. The question I think on most people's minds is, if we know they've been around, are they worse now than they were before? And that's a really good question, because when you're dealing with, like I said, I'm not a parasitologist, but as a wildlife ecologist, what I do know is about population dynamics. And just because you have something doesn't mean it's a population level problem, right? Now somebody could argue, wait, parasites have to be bad because they result in the death of a bird. Well, first of all, not always do parasites result in the death of the host. Right, so that's misnomer number one. Number two, if everything that results in the death of a bird we assume is bad, then we better stop hunting quail pretty damn quick, right? Because that results in the death of a bird. Not if I'm shooting, but if somebody else is, right? So the death of an animal is not. It's real easy to say, hey, parasites are gross. Show a picture of them. These eyeworms are disgusting. The research on them, God, if you look at the ocular cavity, whatever it's called, and you look at it, it's wicked. So it definitely looks like something that should be a problem, and it very well may be at some point. Right now, from my understanding of the literature, and I've reviewed the literature on this to the extent that I can, what we know is there are eyeworms in certain quail populations. They have a range of prevalence in certain populations. Some birds are just chock full of them. Some populations have way more than other populations, and in some cases, some birds look, the level they've got them looks pretty catastrophic and may be a problem. What we do not have evidence of, to my understanding, and I'm happy for anybody to correct me on this, is evidence that eyeworms are causing population level declines. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't one day. It could just be we haven't documented yet. That's why the research is good. But at the end of the day, what we've documented, from what I can tell, is eyeworms are out there. Sometimes there's a lot of them. And my guess is, and you go back to, we were talking about environmental stressors. When you have a lot of environmental stressors and a population's not in terribly good condition and health-wise, they probably can have more of an impact than they would, say, in a healthy population. And that's not my opinion. That's just basic population dynamics. When populations are stressed, they're more susceptible to all kinds of things. So without current evidence that they're having a population level decline or a population level impact, the research, I think, needs to be focused on, let's figure out that. Do they get to the point where they do have a population level? Like what prevalence rate, I think we found that, I think they're doing that with CWD. I hate to throw a bone to the pine goat people, but they've done a pretty good job of researching CWD to figure out at what point you start to see the population decline, right? In some states, to my knowledge, I think Wyoming, had some parts of the state where they actually got to that point. So figuring out what prevalence rate could be a population level issue, that would be a really cool way to go about it. But yeah, to my knowledge, there's no evidence that it's having a population level decline. No one has documented that as the leading cause of a decline. And without that piece of information, which I think is incredibly crucial, we need to keep an eye on eyeworms. We need to study eyeworms. We need to study eyeworms to the extent that we can, but we probably don't. I've seen nothing to let me go cry that this is our top issue yet. I would say habitat is still our issue. We monitor these things, we get a better understanding of them, and we figure out, if they become an issue. But just having a parasite doesn't make it an issue.
Yeah. Rick, were you about to say something?
No, I was just going to say, obviously, we're not saying it doesn't affect certain individuals, and made a good point there, on the population side of it. There's, kind of separating affecting some individuals versus, it having an actual measurable population level effect. And so that's, just kind of good to kind of keep those things separate there as far as, we're not saying it doesn't have an effect on some individuals. It certainly does,
sure,
or can, but
well, Rick, you bring up a really good point
population.
You bring up a really good point that I missed. So what separates, say, the wildlife biology or the wildlife ecology field from, say, veterinary medicine or from sometimes zoology or some of the biological fields is, and this sounds weird to say, but I'll say it because we say it to students all the time. Calcutt, you and I say it all the time to students. Individuals don't matter,
yeah.
Right? This isn't a veterinary clinic, right? So an individual quail or a bunch of individual quail having really high loads of eyeworms or any other parasite for that matter. I know there's been a ton of research on cecal worms and all kinds of stuff. That alone is not sufficient to bring it to the point where it's something that we have to address because we care about populations. If we cared about individuals, we wouldn't hunt, right? The whole assumption of our profession is that a certain amount of individuals die and a certain amount don't. And if hunting is causing a negative growth rate in the population, it needs to be stopped or amended in a way that doesn't affect that. We care about the population, and monitoring quail populations is no easy task, right? It's very difficult to get enough precision to detect changes from year to year. But if an individual has it, that sucks. It sucks for that individual, but it doesn't mean that the population is in jeopardy, right? And again, I'm leaving the door open as a scientist. We may get to that point, and if we get to that point, I'm all for the abundance of research leading us to the point where we are more prepared and more poised to address that if and when we get there. We are currently not there.
Yeah, so to follow up on those good points that you and Rick made, so, we don't really have an idea, what the prevalence rate is, across all the different areas that we that have quail, and then whether or not, to what extent that's influencing these populations. But, because I think about, like you said, they found it in Texas, in the 60s, and
yeah,
I think that study was like 44%.
It was in that range, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So it was like in the 40 some odd percent of prevalence rate there, and so maybe I'll admit I have not read that entire study, so I can't really recall what came out of it, but that may just be something that's typical. Maybe we find that out, that a certain percentage has it, but we just don't know. Like I said, what Rick said, some individuals are going to succumb to that, but yeah, like you said, we need to, if we're going to continue to do the science like you were talking about, Mark, we need to be able to do it where we can really figure out all those aspects of a local population or regional or what scale we look at it at, but what that prevalence rate is, what's that population looking like before and how many have it, and then to what extent, under what conditions does that become a problem?
Yeah, and it goes back to we talked about other things like it all depends on how you frame the issue, right? If you we used to do this during the again, the deer people just have gone through this kind of thing a little more than we have, so they're a good example. If you remember, not that long ago, there was all this research documenting the fawn mortality rate and the cause of fawn mortality rate. And it was like 90% of fawn mortality was because of predators. Well, of course. What did you think was happening to fawns? Did you think they were just walking off cliffs? No. Predators eat prey, right? That was not shocking. But the public heard those numbers. They heard 90%, and then it was coyotes in the Deep South that were getting blamed. Whatever huge percentage of fawn mortality was coyotes, so everyone waged war on coyotes. And you know what didn't happen? The deer population didn't shift one bit as a result of all those efforts, because that wasn't the limiting factor in the population, right? The fact that quail may die, some quail may die from an eyeworm parasite load, again, that's something to study, that is something to understand. We have, to my knowledge, there's no evidence yet that we're at a point where that requires some type of intervention, whatever that may be, to affect the population any more than saying that, hey, predators ate your fawns. Now, there's a point at which, and we've seen this in the quail literature, James Martin published some really cool research out of tall timbers. They showed that when the predator index got above a certain point, it was time to probably implement some predator management. And they documented when they did that the population in those systems that were not habitat limited, right, that was tremendously well-managed habitat in the Red Hills, they showed that those populations increased, I can't remember what it was, 13 or 20% in the fall population, and a bunch of other increases in fecundity and stuff. So that's an example where that issue was studied to the point where you could look at when a problem or when an issue or a factor, like say predation, reached a certain point, it was time to intervene, right? And that's the way we're supposed to go about wildlife management, right? We identify the limiting factors, which we all agree, and I think most quail biologists in the world would agree, or in the country, that it's habitat. And when that's no longer a limiting factor, right, we go to see what else is limiting the population from growing. Perhaps it's food, perhaps it's nest success, perhaps it's brood survival. And once we understand those, we intervene through management to increase the population to whatever our desired result is. And if we get there with parasites, with bobwhites, I'll be the first person to say, hey, it's time to do something. I don't think the research has gotten to a point where we understand quite enough at what point this issue requires management intervention, if ever. It may maybe a 40% prevalence rate isn't enough. Maybe it is, but my understanding of those prevalence rate is that's just detection, right? So they could have one eyeworm, or they could have 1,000 in their orbital cavity. I don't. So if most of the research I've looked at, they show the prevalence rate, and then they kind of show some other rates of kind of, I guess, how extreme the load is, the parasite load. And that's probably the number we've got to get to understand is at what point is a bird dying prematurely. Keep in mind, a quail doesn't live that long, right? All they've really got to do is live long enough to breed, right, and hopefully make some chicks. So if this is a source of mortality that is unexpected and is affecting the population, it may be that it may not be something we have to do. It may be something like a lot of other issues, like, hey, when the prevalence rate hits this, or the parasite load hits this through sampling, maybe you just back off your harvest 10%. We've learned that through other intervention methods, right? So maybe it's just one of those things we just need more research on to understand the population level at which this is an issue, if it's an issue, and then what to do about it. And I just don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, because to your point, talking about predators, that's kind of the first thing. First time somebody had sent me a message asking about these parasites, and is that something to worry about? Was like, well, I feel like this is another one of those things like predator management. Again, going back to that, I don't even think you need to think about that until you have that. Like, you can rule out the habitat being some component of habitat being a limiting factor, and then to your point about James's study at Tall Timbers. You're in the Red Hills. That whole region's got that house in order pretty much. It's a large area of really high quality habitat, real well managed habitat. So then if you can identify that some stressor is limiting populations, then you can step in and handle that. And then, well, too, it's to the predator manager side, you get a 13% increase. Then that's kind of up to the manager. Like, is that worth the effort to do that?
Good point.
So from James mentioned a 13% increase. Then that's a landowner or a land manager needs to make that decision. Does that predator management, now that I've got habitat's not limiting, but there's I can implement some rigorous predator management and get that 13% bump, is that worth that effort? And people will have to make the same decision if we find out that, yes, when habitat is not a limiting factor, if we were to find out that these parasites could be, then, there are available medicated feeds, that you can put out that can reduce some of that parasite load out there. And so then you're going to have to do that same thing there. But again, I keeps coming back to, habitat being one of those things you got to roll out first. And I think that would be a step in anything we're looking at to see on these studies if we were to do those.
Yeah, I was just going to mention too, real quick, that it's interesting you brought up the fawn predation study there, or multiple studies that have been done. It's kind of an interesting case there. A lot of those studies were actually done in some places where fawn habitat was not that great either. And so, if you look at it, and that's not to discredit the research or anything, or the land management or anything like that, but it's just, maybe that gets overlooked a little bit sometimes. Maybe that the context of these things were measured in, that habitat was a limiting factor in some of those areas potentially as far as being able to hide fawns. And so, maybe not in every case, but I know of several of those that were, there were some habitat issues as well. So that just kind of brings it back around to, some of the habitat things there that are lacking. If you don't have that taken care of first, then all these other things are kind of a moot point until you kind of get that issue there where you need to be. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rick. I forgot about that. So when I was at UGA, I did a big lit review of all the research we had on predator management and deer fawn stuff. And again, not to give the pine goats too much of an airtime here, but it's a really good point you brought up, because that research, we learned a lot of things from that research. To your point, yeah, a lot of them, that fawning cover was probably the limiting factor for sure, especially, and I think if we look around a lot of properties we're all on a lot of the time, that's all obviously the case. The other issue is a lot of those studies were kind of one-off years. They were, hey, fawn recruitment was this, we trapped one year, fawn recruitment went up the next year, but it didn't all the time. And most of the studies that looked at anything long-term more than a couple of years are the ones that looked at a true control versus treatment, where you had, they knew the fawn recruitment rate before the intervention on both sites and it was comparable. What we found was, and I think UGA's actually put out an update to that extension document, what we found was a lot of times you didn't really get a return on your investment from predator management to increase deer fawn recruitment, because again, I think the reason is, to your point, Rick, it wasn't necessarily that predators were the issue. It was the issue that there wasn't good fawn habitat, and predators were having more of an influence than they probably could have been. But just removing the predators doesn't solve the problem. The ultimate problem is the fact that you've got a limitation of a habitat component. And then these, like you were saying earlier, James, these other things have more of an influence when that happens, right? So, James, you mentioned they have a product out called Quail Guard, and I'm looking forward to seeing the published research on the effects of that. So again, I'm not a parasitologist, and I've never developed any kind of feed supplement or anything to help with something like this. But if we take what we know from the research approaches, other interventions, like you were saying, James, with predator management, and Rick pointing out the habitat thing, if I was going to design a study to look at the impacts of Quail Guard, the things that I would want to focus on is making sure I had two comparable properties with as close to comparable quail densities as possible, and documented evidence that they were both not in decline, or both in decline. I guess it doesn't matter, but their trajectories would need to be the same, right? You don't want to, the population dynamics of an increasing and a decreasing population can change how an intervention looks in the results, right? So I'd want to have comparable populations, comparable cover, comparable stressors. So not just drought and weather, habitat management. If there is hunting on either one, it'd have to be about the same timing, the same intensity. You want to have as comparable a property as possible, assuming just control and treatment, right? It's 1 and 2. To make sure that you're controlling for all the other kind of spurious things that could affect your results, right? If you don't want to have something else come in and show that your intervention didn't work when it would have had the properties been comparable, right? So comparable properties, comparable habitat, comparable densities, comparable everything. If bobwhite habitat, again, it should be comparable and very similar across them. If it's not ideal, for example, then I would want it to be similarly not ideal across both properties, right? If, for example, if brooding cover was limiting on property A and not B, that's going to throw a wrench in your results. So if you could do it that way, and that's just keeping it comparable, then you've got the issue of like replicability. If you just got property 1 and property 2, it's really, really limiting your ability to find a really pronounced effect of your treatment, whatever it is, right? Because you're limited to what's happening on those properties, things that you can't see. That's why we replicate, right? That's why we have as many properties as possible. So if you could have multiple properties, they're all similar in nature, and then you randomly assigned this one's got this product and this one doesn't get this product, and they're all getting it distributed, the same way, or they're affecting it, whatever. Then that'd be the way I'd go about trying to figure out if there was a documented a level impact increase, for example, in this treatment, this product. Now, then you got to ask yourself, all right, which metrics matter, right? So with quail populations, we've done a lot of this, right? We know which population metrics are important, right? If you can increase density, that's great, right? That's what the ultimate we all are getting at, is increasing density, right? You want to be able to show I increased the population. Well, quail densities, it's a tough thing to measure with any precision, right? We've all learned that the hard way. That's why covey counts drive us all to drinking, and whistle counts maybe a little bit less, but not that much, right? Getting the precision to detect differences is really important, right? So if you do like covey counts, right, you can use that as a way to estimate covey density. But it's not just the coveys calling, it's not just that. There's a lot that goes into modeling actual covey density on the landscape in the fall. Same thing with summer monitoring. And there's an abundance of research on that. So then you got to look at, okay, what if it's a radioed population, right? Well, we know that overwinter survival is a huge impact. We know that brood survival is a huge impact. Those two alone are probably two of the bigger parameters that affect population growth. So if you could document an increase in overwinter survival or a subsequent increase in brood survival, that would be really good evidence to suggest, hey, you've got something here. Now, Calicut, to your point, the degree of that increase, if you can detect that difference, right? That's what's important, because then the landowner's got to decide, what does this cost and what is the return on investment. And I think we keep referencing James Martin's paper. I think it was some of his students. Of course, I don't know if James was the first author, so no disrespect to his students, because I know they did a lot of the work. But I think it was about a 13-ish, maybe 15% increase in fall abundance. Now, there were much larger increases in reproductive parameters, chicks per hen. I know Alex Jackson's research showed some of that with predator management. So it depends on what metric you're looking at, but it's got to be those metrics that are important to quail populations. If you increase, for example, nest success, that might be impactful to the population, but we don't really have good evidence to suggest that nest success alone is what's driving population growth, right? It's typically overwinter survival, brood survival, those kinds of the other fecundity measures. So again, getting the study set up right, getting the true comparison so you can actually take out all the noise and focus on the treatment itself and isolate that as the mechanism of the difference, that's hard to do. It's hard to do. That's why it's so hard to do experimental science with field species, because we don't have labs to control this. I mean, you can do it in a lab, but of course the population level is really where you want to do it. You want to do a field experiment, and it's tough. So I'm looking forward to seeing a field experiment with comparable sites under comparable conditions, with comparable densities, comparable trajectories, and the only real difference being this new product that's out. And if that shows that we've got a measurable increase in the population, great. That's a tremendous tool in the toolbox. When that comes out, I'll look forward to it, and we'll make a podcast about that.
Yeah. And like you said, Mark, trying to hone in on those things that matter to population growth. Kind of have to look at all of those things you mentioned, overwinter survival and all that. 'Cause, in the duck world, sorry to bring up ducks again. I know I do this every time.
That's all right. We already did deer a few times. That's worse.
Yeah, that's true. So you committed the more egregious sin on this podcast than I did. So, if you just looked at some of the earlier stuff on predator management in the prairies for ducks, some of you got Piron and Pam Garrettson and
I remember that. Courtney
Admonson, and several others. And what's the one that looked at the radiating effects? Was that Peggy?
Peggy Kuhn. Yeah.
Peggy Kuhn. Yeah. So a lot of those, if you just looked at the nest success side of things, no doubt it was, in areas that were acres that were trapped, huge boosts in nest success, going from 10 or 15 or less percent to 90 some odd percent.
Oh yeah, I remember all that. It was crazy.
Drastic,
huge increases. Yeah,
just absolutely drastic increases in nest success. But then, with Courtney's work looking at brood survival on those same areas, avian predators, and I'm sure mink and things on the way to the wetland were just hammering that superabundance of ducklings from that. And so really at the end of it, recruitment didn't change. That wasn't a significant difference between those. And so really at the end of the day, you didn't really add a substantial amount, to that fall flight. So making sure you're not missing some metric that's important in there, what are you getting in the increase, and which increase matters the most
Yeah,
to
that's
that
right.
population
And like I said, the quail community, God, I mean, again, hats off to the Martin Game Lab, because they've done more work than anybody in terms of what's the most robust way to monitor quail populations and what metrics matter the most. I mean, they've kind of rewritten the book on that in the modern quail era. So we know what metrics matter. We know which metrics to monitor, and they're not always the easiest metrics, right? It's much easier to go out there and say, just go out there and listen and just record what you hear, right? But him and John Yeiser published one of the coolest papers I've ever seen that shows that without truly modeling all the things we know that affect detection probability and availability, if you don't get into that, you're probably not getting a really good representation of how many quail are on your landscape. So that stuff's hard, it's tough to do, but it's necessary if you want to do it. And like the duck example, I remember all that when all that research was coming out. So you can increase a metric, a particular population metric, but it does not necessarily translate to an increase in abundance. So like with ducks especially, because you're counting ducks at a flyway, i.e. continental scale. With bobwhite, we're typically counting them on a proper property scale. Hopefully it's a big property. But even then, just being able to detect that difference through the most robust, scientifically agreed upon methodology is not easy. And not every population metric, and the public may not know this because this is getting pretty deep into the weeds of population dynamics. Not every population metric has the same impact on a population's trajectory. Right? That's why we study population dynamics, because we know that. So that's why we don't monitor. That's why clutch size, for example. No one's really interested in clutch size, changing in bobwhites, because it varies, but it's not a huge parameter in terms of influencing population growth rate, right? It's why we don't focus on survival as much during certain times of the year, because it's not as influential on the population growth rate. I mean, keep in mind, you got a species that on average has got a 20% annual survival rate, and that's not a lot. Little things can tweak that, but it's got to be the right metric. And like I said, I look forward to seeing that in the literature. I look forward to seeing in the wildlife literature, right? That's one of the other things that we got to be aware of. The wildlife community is more than capable of reviewing these papers and understanding their influence on population level quail dynamics, and that's what's needed, right? We need to see research on this issue in the journals that are focused and typically focused on quail management or cover quail management issues, so the quail scientific community can review them and understand what's what and where we need to go from here. And that's something I'm really looking forward to.
Me too. I think that's a good way to kind of summarize up what most of us want to see on any topic, is we get that research that really gives us guidance to inform our management decisions and identifies those silver bullets. I just wish everybody could see that the habitat was really the silver bullet that's been there the whole time. But
well, we could probably have a whole nother podcast about why is the wildlife community so focused on silver bullets. And I have some theories that I don't have any data other than my own observations, but we typically like to go to the thing that requires the least amount of energy and dedication. Rick, when was it when the surrogator boxes took over? What year was that? You remember that?
Yeah, that was probably 10 or 15 years ago somewhere.
I'm thinking, 10 or 15. I know I was in grad school, and I don't think they caught on. I don't know, Rick, I was in grad school, so I wasn't in the quail community as much as you were back then, but I remember hearing landowners talk about them and that it was going to save the quail populations, and that was the solution. And thank goodness, the research community showed up strong. I remember, I think it was Robbie Perez had a paper, him and Reggie maybe out of, I don't know where it was from, where I think you had to put like 2 million or something to get some like 1 or 2% in your bag. And it was some crazy number that clearly demonstrated, and they weren't the only ones.
I think Kentucky looked at it too,
Yeah, that this was not an appropriate solution, right? But the research community came through and said, okay, look, people want to talk about this, let's figure it out, and that's really the key. So I think we like silver bullets because it's hard let's be honest, quail management is not always easy. You got to stay on top of it. You never really get to stop. It's burning, it's thinning, it's doing these things, and there's market drivers that sometimes make it harder, right? In the ag sector, we all know there's market drivers there. In the pine market, there's challenges to it. So if we could, just to borrow another example from James Martin, it's like fast food. We all know how to grow a garden, or we could learn. Calicut, I know you and Rick do a lot more gardening. I don't do any, but I could probably do it. I probably couldn't do it as well as you guys, but we don't all choose to because we know there's another solution that's easier. And I think that's what comes down to wildlife management a lot, is finding a solution that's a little bit easier because we all have limited time and limited resources.
So yeah, and if we do, I totally agree. We could completely have an entire episode to talk about folks' obsession with silver bullets and wildlife management, and so maybe we need to plan to get that on the books. But say we do have some research that comes out in the future that identifies that putting out some medicated feed is gonna give you a certain population increase, whatever percentage that is. Landowners start wanting to do that. Rick, I just immediately think to supplemental feeding regulations and all how that varies in states to state. Is this medicated feed gonna fit into a category like that? And I guess you can only speak to Mississippi, so like if someone was gonna put out quail guard here in Mississippi, what would they need to be aware of?
Yeah, so in Mississippi we have supplemental feeding regulations for wild animals, and so each state may very well vary. Some states may not regulate at all, but I guess it kind of came a little bit more here about just with deer, the interest in that, and also issues with baiting, different things. And so there was the attempt made to try to kind of put some of this in some regulatory context for enforcement and those kind of things. That's what a lot of these things kind of come down to. But anyway, Mississippi does have supplemental feeding regulations for wild animals. That does not apply into like people's backyard if they're feeding birds and that kind of thing. That's actually stated in our regulations, that nobody's coming out to shake you down for having a bird feeder in your backyard, but, more so kind of more out in the areas beyond, someone's home there. But specifically deer, now this with CWD, this is all kind of coming into a bigger deal with just feeding and how that works into the spread of disease and that kind of thing. But something like this medicated feed for quail or potentially other things would fall into our supplemental feeding regulations. And of course we have certain times of year that you can do specifically for quail, but our regulations specifically state what kinds of grains can be broadcast. Again, there's regulations on time of year and the rates and that kind of thing. If you were doing this specifically for quail, like in a supplemental feeding kind of context for broadcast feeding for quail, but it's, again, specifically states what can be spread. And so by the letter of the regulation, you wouldn't be able to necessarily spread this type of feed, but you could place it in feeders. Our regulations specify either above ground covered feeders or broadcast or spin cast feeders that are protected from weather. So again, there's regulatory language there on the feeding, and so this could be done, but it would need to be done in a specific way in our regulations. Again, this may be different in other states, and so of course, as Mark was talking about, if the research gets to where maybe this is something maybe there is something that needs to be looked at with this, then maybe we look at something attempting to make the regulations a little bit different or something like that. But as of right now, folks do need to be aware if you're going to go down this road. Again, we kind of laid out everything as far as best we can about what we know. Certainly there's a lot of things we still don't know. I'll be the first to admit. There's a lot I still don't know, and would really like to know about a lot of these things. But again, we've got to design the research and everything to get those answers. But certainly, there may come a time when we have some better information that suggests this is something that should be looked at a little more. Then maybe that's something we look at on the regulations then. But as of now, there are regulations you need to follow. Same with predator management. We're talking about kind of the predator control. A lot of people kind of kind of think about a lot of these things, and just want to kind of jump into something. But you got to be aware there's regulations too on some of these fur bearers, that are at least in Mississippi. Again, in some states it may be different, but raccoons are fur bearers. Coyotes are classified as nuisance animals here. So you can trap coyotes all year round, but raccoons, fall into a certain season. So you got to be aware of those kind of things too. Any of these kind of supplemental practices like we're talking about sometimes, there may be maybe some regulatory things you got to think about too. How you're doing it, just not so you don't get crosswise with the law. So again, the regulatory part of it's something we got to think about too. So just kind of putting that out there that's something to be aware of if you're going to go down this road with some of these supplemental practices. That you got to make sure you're also within regulations, so you don't get crosswise with law enforcement. So
Yeah, and that's a good point, Rick. And there's some other, supplemental feeding is just about as old as quail management is, right? And it's gone through a couple of evolutions. Back in the day, it was primarily like stationary feeders out there where the quail would come, and there's grain sorghum or something. It's typically Milo, is typically what we're feeding. And then several years back, the Red Hills region, I think they were the first ones to do it, but they started doing more of a feed line, like a very squiggly, covered most of the property, and they're spreading it with a broadcast spreader, usually about 60 feet wide. And there's usually never more than 150 or 200 yards in between feed lines interacting, because it's like I said, squiggles all throughout the property. If you can see my finger right now, I'm doing a squiggly. So that has become kind of the standard supplemental feeding strategy for bobwhite in states that allow it. And I know several states do allow it. The idea that it's not really concentrating quail because it's so uniform across the property, and there's been a bunch of research on it to show that the documented impacts it can have to the population. The idea being that this would not concentrate quail around a stationary feeder the way more traditional quail feeding was. My understanding with Quail Guard is they have a specialized feeding distributor for the quail can be safer. They can access the feed without exposure. And there was a bunch of research on this in the 90s and early 2000s that looked at it, and there was some data that showed, hey, okay, if your stationary feeders can increase mortality to some degree, and there were some that said, hey, when they're placed in cover, really good cover, and they're managed correctly, that they really don't, right? So if you're going to put a feeder out in general, especially for a product like this, making sure it's in good cover, that kind of thing, doing everything you can in any situation not to congregate quail unnecessarily in an area, because there's all kinds of challenges that come with that. With any population, that's part of the reason CWD spreads so much is, when they're all, sticking their nose in the same pile or sticking their nose in the same little pipe, trying to get corn out. So there's some challenges there, just things to be aware of. My understanding is this stuff cannot be broadcast because it can't be exposed to the elements, is my understanding, which is totally understandable. So for the time being, it looks like it's going to be a stationary approach. So just making sure you're thinking about that and the predator context of the landscape and the type of cover you're putting these things in if you choose to go that route. There's, like I said, there's best management practices for how to address these kind of issues. And to Rick's point, making sure you've checked with your state game and fish to make sure what is allowed and what isn't, and the timing it's allowed, to make sure you don't want to get cross with the law if that's the route you want to take.
So yeah, I just thought that was something good to bring up, because if we do, hopefully there will be some well-designed research to look at this, and if the result is that some of this is going to be helpful or a valuable management tool, then I certainly want people, if they're going to implement it, to be within the lines of the law. I kind of remember my time wearing the green shirt like Rick, everybody calling in and asking questions about stuff. You want to make sure that you stay out of trouble there. And like Rick said, it may take some states the way their current feeding regulations are, and might have to catch up to some new management practices like this that might come out. So but you need to make sure that you are in line with what the state regulations are regarding feeding if you're going to proceed putting something like this out. But fellas, you got anything else to add, or does that kind of sum up our conversation today?
I'll just wrap up with a couple of just reiterations. Like I said, the presence of a parasite does not necessarily, if you take anything from this, the presence of a parasite does not necessarily indicate a negative impact on the population. That is just we've like I said, these things have been around. We've documented eyeworms and bobwhite since at least the 60s. That doesn't mean they showed up in the 60s. That's the first time somebody looked. I think with Sharpies it was in the 30s, maybe something like that. So like I said, animals have parasites, right? That's something we do know. And quail have had eyeworms before. It's not novel. The research is pretty novel in terms of the last 10 or 15 years. There's been a lot more research on this in a lot of toxicology and parasitology and disease journals. So we know more about it now than we ever have. That's a good thing. But we're still, in my opinion, we're still waiting to see population level impacts. And if we see population level impacts, then the next step would be to design studies to design well-structured studies with comparable populations and comparable cover under comparable stress events to actually determine if this product that's out now can have a population level increase. And again, that's kind of the orderly progression, the logical progression we need for this to be a management tool that gets recommended in populations where we have determined the prevalence of this is a point where it's an issue. Currently, we're not at that point yet that I've seen in the literature. We don't know the prevalence rate at which this becomes problematic, if at all. We don't know if we've reached that in any population, and we don't know yet whether there's robust information on how this product impacts populations. So I hope that research is in the works. I hope it's coming, and I look forward to reading it. Again, as soon as I see some stuff that shows some of those things, I'm all for it. We just got to figure out, there's a few steps I think we need to get to before we get too far down the road on this very particular issue maybe affecting quail, but that's in the stratosphere now. We're talking about it, and hopefully we keep talking about it. We keep talking about the science behind it, and we figure out how to move forward in a way that benefits not only the bird that we all care about, but also the management profession that everybody relies on. And with that, I'll stop yapping.
Well said, Mark, and I think that takes us on home pretty well. So we'll just have to talk about getting together next time and talking about that silver bullet episode, I guess, is the next thing we got to write on the agenda.
We might want to bring on a psychologist for that one.
Yeah, probably.
Hey, James.
Yep.
I may mention real quick, just too, that we've been talking a lot about habitat and management and different things there. Certainly, folks have that interest in wanting to know more about managing their property. Certainly reach out to resource professionals. Our agency. James and Mark does some of that. Again, our agency has a whole private land staff. There's other partner agencies we work with, that have some folks that provide technical guidance on private lands. And probably covered this before, but just always feel like it's good to reiterate that, there are folks out there to reach out to potentially come, make some recommendations and evaluate, conditions that you've got on your property and that kind of thing. And so if you want to know more about some of that kind of thing, about managing, most people probably aren't going to want to go all out quail, but, it's good that more people seem to be embracing just managing their property for just kind of the habitat. And so I think the more of that we can get going in certain areas, just building that up, the better chance we got of seeing kind of quail populations responding and coming back. So.
Yeah, good point, Rick. Light some fires,
Yeah.
I can't say enough good things about the small game or the private lands program in Mississippi. So if you're a Mississippi resident, please contact MDWFP. They do a great job. And they, some of the most talented biologists in the country at this agency, and that's not just my opinion. I've heard that from around. So we've got the resources to help. Give them a call. Don't call me.
Absolutely, we do. We're very fortunate here in Mississippi. We do have such a great state agency technical staff, and there's, like Rick said, there's others. There's NGO folks like Quail Forever that have some talented biologists that will come out too. A lot of times they go in tandem with a private lands person from MDWF&P. So sometimes you can get assistance from multiple folks here in the state, but sure across the country there's resources like that to get people to come to your property, tell you, evaluate your habitat, and maybe help you find those missing components. And like Rick said, may not be going all in quail, but there's lots of benefits, for turkey or deer management, particularly prescribed fire, that's going to create ideal or better quail covers.
James, I'll give you guys some credit too. There's Extension has a lot of great educational resources and products out there too, and we're working to try to make some more of that kind of stuff too. But so there's a lot of resources out there. So
sure.
Extension has some good ones too. So.
Follow the MSU Extension Game Bird program on social media.
That's right. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and got a lot of good management videos and things out there now, and more to come. As soon as the spring hits, Rick and I got to get his handsome mug in front of the camera. Talk some quail habitat management. So definitely follow us for some of that, and then take advantage of the resources that are available to you out there to help you get that habitat house in order.
There you go. Ended on bringing back that analogy back. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well,
Bumper
gentlemen,
sticker coming soon.
Yeah, we need to get those. Maybe we'll get you a truck wrap for your whole truck.
Just be like Kentucky and just have that whole quail scene on the side of their quail biologist.
Is your habitat house in order? Question mark. All right, so yeah, take advantage of that, folks. And fellas, thank y'all so much for making it through the technical difficulties and whatnot to get this episode done. So appreciate y'all's time, and we'll looking forward to the next time.
All right, thanks. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us on Game Bird University Podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped, or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_GameBird, or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Game Bird Program.